All right, thanks for tuning in to another episode of the WhyInfluence podcast. Today we have an awesome guest. His name is Tom Schwab, and he's the founder of a website called Interview Valet, where you can create a profile either as a podcast guest or a podcast host, and it's a matching platform to help bring together people. And today we're going to be really diving into how to leverage other people's podcasts to grow your influence, to grow your voice, and to get your message out there. So first of all, I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time today, Tom.
Jeremy, I'm thrilled to be here, and I appreciate all you do. Anybody that says doing a podcast is easy has never done it or never done it well. It's just the great ones make it look easy.
Yeah, thanks. So real quick before we get into things, can you give like a 2 or 3 sentence pitch about what your brand is all about, coming from your words?
Yeah. And so my belief is that this idea of breaking through the noise is laughable. All of us are just probably adding to the noise. I think the best way to get known by your customers is to get in on the conversation that's already going on. And, that's the easiest way I can see doing that is leveraging other people's platforms, specifically podcast interviews. And so Interview Valet, our mission is to personally introduce inspiring thought leaders to millions of ideal customers they could serve for the benefit of all. So we're really doing a lot of the introductions just to spur the conversations.
Yeah, I love that. And while I was digging into you more, I saw that you've got YouTube videos of you giving advice. I've watched an interview with you that was linked in your LinkedIn profile as a featured post from somebody on another podcast. So you've got this business where you're making these connections, bringing people together for podcast guests and hosts, but you're also sharing a lot for yourself and for your brand.
Very much so. And I've been a guest on over 1,200 podcast interviews, and our company has served over 500 clients over the last 6 years on 20,000 interviews. So with that, I'm an engineer by degree. And so we're always trying to learn things, refine the process, make it better. So I openly share that. We wrote a book a few years ago called Podcast Guest Profits. And then I see so many things day in and day out that I just started doing a daily live stream called Podcast Guest Profits Tip of the Day. And it's always something that you can do to be a better podcast guest and really leverage other people's platforms better to grow your brand and to grow your business.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, 1,200 podcasts that you're a guest on. That's crazy. So you've shared a lot. You've put a lot out there. Is there someone that comes to mind as far as like somebody that you've impacted in a way that you didn't expect as a result of sharing?
Very much so. And this is one that explains why I do what I do and what a difference that marketing and podcasting can make. So I got invited to a live event. It was a high-end live event about a year ago. And JB Glossinger, who is the longest running daily podcast ever, he's got over 4,000 daily episodes at Morning Coach. He was a client of ours. And he's got a great podcast, but he wanted to get out onto other shows to get to new audiences, to build new listeners and followers. And he invited me down to Florida to meet one of the people that I had helped arrange there. Right. So JB is on a podcast, and there was a guy by the name of Sean that heard him on a podcast. And Sean was in a very, very dark place. He was depressed, hated his job, hated everything that was going on there. And he was contemplating some very bad decisions that, would have ended his life and really destroyed his family. And he heard JB and then started to listen to his podcast, became a client of his, joined a mastermind with him. And he said his life is 180 degrees different. And they invited me down there to tell the story and to thank me for making that introduction. And to me, all of the other stats and any downloads or financial numbers or anything like that, those pale in comparison. That's the thing that I am most proud of. It's a picture that I have in my office here of JB, Sean, and myself. And I'm like, our company, our brand, really, that's what we're about, helping people. And if you do that, the money comes.
Yeah, that's amazing. And you obviously didn't expect having something like that going into this. Like you were creating the business to make a difference, helping people be guests in other shows and find guests, and then you started sharing more. But like these impacts that you're having, like you can't really predict like the kind of impact that you're going to get.
No, not at all. And I laugh because I wrote this book and my mom wanted a copy. So I gave it to her and then she gave it back to me and she's like, well, you didn't sign it. So I had to sign it. She read the entire book and she's like, honey, I have no idea what a podcast is. She's 80 years old, right? I have no idea what you do. And I basically just explained that, Mom, we introduce people that should know each other for the betterment of everybody. And she's like, oh, that's nice. She still probably tells everybody I'm an engineer because she understands that.
Nice. Yeah, that's awesome. So you've got a business focused solely on helping people become guests in other shows and leverage other shows to grow their voice, get their voice out there. So let's dive into that a little bit. Let's say let's start at the early phase. So people that maybe are starting to share, they found their message, but they haven't really been on any podcasts as guests yet. What would be some like early advice for people that are looking to be podcast guests?
Yeah, and I think Gary Vaynerchuk talks about jab, 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 right hook. I think as a podcast guest, you can look at it as serve, 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 ask, right? So really show up to serve the audience. Podcasts are an awful place to sell, but a great way to get to that know, like, and trust with people. And I see so many people that are starting to robo pitch, and I hate that word pitch. To me, that should be a 4-letter word. It's like you pitch a baseball, you introduce a person. And so from that, if you've got something that you think you could help the audience with, well, reach out to the host. Find out podcasts that would resonate with what you're talking about. That give, ask, right? Give a rating and review. Give by sharing their content on social media. Give by making comments. Then you can reach out. You've earned the right to reach out to the host and say, hey, Jeremy, I love this podcast. I was listening to this episode. I thought that was really great. I think I could add value to you and your audience. Then that give, you'll find that hosts are asking you to be on the podcast. The flip side of that, what most people do is, I probably get 2 to 3 pitches a day, and I don't have my own podcast, right? And all of the pitches start out with, Tom, I love your podcast and would be a great guest. And I'm like, clearly you haven't listened to my podcast. I've got a autoresponder that I just send them in that says, hey, if you can send me a link to your favorite episode, I'd be happy to send you a link to my schedule. And up to this point, nobody's taken me up on it.
Nice. That's awesome. Yeah. So I like that. You said serve, 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 and then ask, or give, and ask. So the whole idea is to, as a guest, you want to give a lot to the audience. And then, but even before that, to be a guest, you've got to give a lot to that host to get on the radar, especially as an early podcast guest, that you can't be like, hey, I've been on all these shows. So you can start by leaving a review, commenting on their social medias, and liking their stuff, and then reaching out and being like, hey, I listened to this episode, I liked this, and then I think I'd be a good guest. So that's sort of the approach that you've seen to work well.
Yeah. And it's all about personal, that personal relationship. You can go out there now and buy lists of podcasters. I just saw one the other day, and it was like $400 for a list of the, top podcasts with their email address. And I hadn't bought it, but I knew somebody that had bought it, and they shared it with me. And I laughed because I'm like, well, first of all, yes, these are top podcasters, but those aren't the emails they look at, right? And even if you had their personal email that we use, or their text, or their phone number that we text to, just because you have it doesn't mean you can get in there. So you really want to build that personal relationship and start it, not scalable, right? People will say, well, it's more scalable to email 1,000 people. Well, Do you want if you ask 1,000 people, you're going to get 10 yeses, but they're probably not the yeses you want. Focus on building those relationships.
I like that a lot. Yeah, focus on start not scalable. So do the things that you can get that really deep, good interview with, and that's going to help in the long run too, because you can refer back to that interview for future podcasts, and they're going to see, okay, well, you're very relevant to that podcast, as opposed to like blasting out 1,000 emails and then getting on some random podcast that has nothing to do with you, but you're just saying yes because you can get on one.
Exactly. You want to talk about building your influence and influencer marketing, and all of a sudden you get some new podcast that's desperate for guests, and you're talking on, a mommy podcast. Great podcast, but it's not great for you. It's almost like, if you're going fishing for sharks, you don't want to be fishing in the Great Lakes.
Right. Yeah, that's a good one. We've got Cast Ahead. He said, excellent commentary, give. So he liked that. Thanks for tuning in. So, we talked about getting on the first podcast. So let's say that person who's never been on a podcast before lands that first podcast with the method we just talked about. What are some things that they should do to prepare or think about as they approach coming into this podcast?
Yeah, and this is great, because that first one is so important, because that's a proof source to other ones. And at Podcasters Know Podcasters, if you do a good job on the podcast, at the end you could ask, hey, Jeremy, do you know any other podcasts where I could bring value? And if they introduce you to 2 podcast hosts, and so on, your dance card gets filled really quick. But one of the things that's important is that you want to make sure that you sound great. This is important. You want to have a professional microphone, or at least a microphone that sounds great, right? You can get a gaming mic with the boom arm for under $50. Right. You can get, a dynamic microphone. A lot of them are back ordered now because of the shipping problems we have in the world, but you should be able to get a decent microphone for under $100. And that's really,
I've got the ATR 2100, and before the pandemic, you get them all day for around $60 on Amazon. So it's not going to kill your wallet.
Yeah, and now you can probably find them used for under $60.
Right.
But either way, because especially if all you have is the audio, people are going to judge you by that. And nothing ruins your credibility more than sounding like, you're calling in from prison, or you're calling in from, a bathroom. Some people will use earbuds. The problem with that is that that microphone typically ends up right near your collar. So every time you move, you just hear this bang, bang, bang. Even sometimes when you, introduce yourself to the podcast host, I would take a picture of yourself in front of the microphone. They'd look and go, oh, Jeremy's, he's got good equipment. He's going to show up well. The other thing to do is take the pressure off the host. The host has got a lot of things they're doing. They're remembering, okay, I got to hit record here. I've got to, put this in here, there. You want to make it easy for them. So from that standpoint, before you go on, we call it a one sheet. It's like a media kit that says, hey, here's the picture you can use. Here's all my social media, so you don't have to hunt around for them. Here's my bio, and just put it all in one page for them. That makes it easy. And, one of the things that I think is the best question you can ask before a podcast interview is even getting on there. And we talked about this before we hit record. Just ask the host, what can I do to bring the most value to your audience? What are you hoping to get out of this? Because that sets the agenda there. It just makes it so much easier for them. Show up on time, show up a couple minutes before time. You wouldn't believe how many podcast hosts are stressing that they've got a live stream going, and the host and the guest shows up 2 minutes early, or 2 minutes late. You don't want to be the one that's giving the host stress, right? You want to be such a great guest that they're introducing you to their audience and introducing you to other people. There's a great podcaster, Doug Sandler from the Nice Guys on Business podcast. And he said, you don't have to promote yourself, right? If you do a good job, I'll promote you more than you ever could.
Nice. I like that. Yeah, because as a podcast host, I have had an experience where I had a guest that was just, this was before I was live streaming, but the guest was selling very hard and pushing very hard, and it got to a point where I felt uncomfortable as the host because of that. And I like what you just said about how you don't have to sell because you if you do a good job, then the host is going to sell for you. It's going to sell itself.
Yeah, and one of the dirty little secrets in podcasting is when things like that happen, it's funny. The files sometimes get lost, right? I'd love to
Right.
post it, but we had a problem in the recording and it just doesn't see the light of day.
Yeah.
The best tweet I have ever seen in my life came from a guy by the name of Rand Fishkin. Rand started a company called Moz, and then Spark Toro is his current one. He wrote a great book called Lost and Founder. And he said the best way to sell something today is not to sell anything, but earn the respect, awareness, and trust of those who might buy. And really, that's what we're doing on podcasts. That's what we're doing on leveraging other people's platforms.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with that more. And that works on all platforms. It's all about giving as much value as possible, and then you'll get something return at some point as you build that credibility in relationships.
Yep.
So we talked about making life easier on the host. We talked about questions that the guest can ask the host to bring the most value, ways to approach, like getting some hardware and equipment. Is there anything to think about as far as when the guest is having the interview? I know that I watched some of your YouTube videos before we talked, and I saw you had one recently that you posted about, not addressing they or the audience would appreciate this, but it's all about you. Like, do you want to talk about that a little bit, or maybe some tips similar to that?
Yeah. And it gets back to that whole idea of this is a conversation, and it's a conversation that people are listening in on, and that they are listening in on, but you want to connect with individuals, not with the masses. So the best thing that we have seen, and once again, this is not just my opinion, this is based on data, is to talk to the people, right? To talk to one person. So instead of like Jeremy, me saying, well, Jeremy, your audience may consider podcast guesting as a way to grow their brand and their business. And it's like, well, who's he talking to, right?
Right.
It's better to say, if you're listening to this, maybe you're a coach, maybe you are a consultant, maybe you're a brand, and maybe you feel like you are the best kept secret, that you've got something that could help people. You could serve them with your current product. The problem is you are the best kept secret. You just need to get out there. You could leverage podcast interviews. So with that, one of them is like this amorphous audience. The other one, people are listening going, wow, yeah, he understands me. I am a coach. He understands me. Yes, I am the best kept secret. So you're talking to one person, and it's so much more impactful. And from that standpoint, podcasting is a very intimate audience, or intimate medium, right? We've got earbuds in, the sound is cut out there. And so people are really tuning in. So I think you need to talk one-on-one with them.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And that's something I struggled with for a long time, even as a podcast host, is, I started about saying like they and stuff. And then I quickly realized, I talked to Dave Jackson and he gave some tips. And then like I tried to make a note. I even put a picture like next to my screen of one person, so I could just remember, okay, let me talk to one person, not a group of people. And even now, like I still struggle, but sometimes I try to pause and then talk to the audience as opposed to, only talk to the guest as well.
And you say pause, you've got a very calming voice. The other thing that I see people get in trouble with is, and I do it at times, when you get excited, you talk faster and faster and faster. Well, it's hard to understand somebody when they talk fast. And if the host talks slow and the guest talks fast, it's going to sound so much different. 70% of the podcasts are listened to sped up. So if you're used to listening to Jeremy at 1.5x and I come on and I'm talking fast, Jeremy sounds right. I sound like a chipmunk. So you
Right.
need to do a little bit of that mirroring. I think that's what Chris Voss would call it.
Yeah, that's a great point because especially being on your first podcast as a guest, it may be your first appearance doing something like that. You may get more excited and then start talking much faster. So it's good to have that reminder to stay calm because you're talking to a host who's done many interviews and is already comfortable with the medium. So I think that's great advice. So let's say we talked about getting on the show, being on the show, in that early time period. What do you do when you get towards the end of the interview or maybe after the interview? Like what would be some of the common things that you see that are done well in regards to your first appearance as a guest?
Yeah. And I think with that is think about the experience from the listener. You could have a great interview, but I don't care how great of a communicator you are, you can't solve all of their problems. So if they really liked it, give them more resources. Tell them what they can do next. Make it easy for them. And, most digital marketers will tell you, one call to action. I don't disagree with them, but all of our studies has shown give people 3 ways to say yes. Small yes, a medium yes, and then the heck yes. So throughout the interview, you could talk about different things and say, there's a checklist that we have, the pre-interview checklist, and it's got everything that we have learned. And, if that's of value to you, that's a small yes. The medium yes could be more of a book, right? That's usually my medium yes. It's not so much money, but it's time, right? So if they're more interested, give them that way to say yes. The heck yes could be, buying a product. It could be getting on a discovery call. One of the things, especially if you're selling a higher ticket price, whales don't click and big fish don't swim through funnels. If they hear you and are like, wow, Jeremy is somebody that I want to connect with, don't slow them down in a funnel. Give them a way to connect. And then the other thing too is give them one easy place to go to. So, instead of me trying to tell you, oh, I'm on LinkedIn here, I'm on Twitter here, try to figure out which Tom Schwab in Kalamazoo, Michigan I am. It's just
Right.
easier just to make one page and say, if you want to find out more, just go to interviewvalet.com/WhyInfluence, and everything Jeremy and I talk about will be there. Give them one place to go. That helps move people from being just a passive listener to an active visitor, ultimately to an engaged lead. And then the big thing, after that interview goes live, for heaven's sakes, promote it. I am so amazed how many people will get on a podcast interview, they'll say goodbye to the host and never think about that interview again. It's like, this is a great proof source. This is great content. Why wouldn't you want to promote that to your social media? I've written a whole lot of blogs in my life, but every one of them was a homework assignment. So a lot of
Right.
interviews we'll transcribe, then we'll find somebody else, a writer, to break it up and to make blogs. They'll take a nice little quote out. They'll make an audiogram out of it. It's just so amazing, all of the content that you can get out of one podcast interview.
Yeah, I love that. And just going back to before the interview started, Tom had mentioned that he's going to create a page on his website that we can drive the listeners to, and that's what you just talked about there. And we'll say it again at the end. But I like that because you've been on 1,200 podcasts now, and if you've got the traffic, you have a little bit more control over the traffic when it goes to your website as opposed to if it goes to my website. And I've already got the audience here at WhyInfluence, and the whole idea is to try to help you grow your audience. So I like the method that you're using there with driving people back there, and then you can have your small, medium, and large yes.
And it's also important, Jeremy, because this interview is evergreen, right? So we're recording it in 2020. There's somebody right now in 2025 that's listening to this, and they're like, this is great. Well, if they go back to, the Interview Valet website, I guarantee you in the next 5 years, that homepage is going to change. And so if the things that I talked about today aren't on there, they're just going to get frustrated. So why not send them to an evergreen page for evergreen content?
Yeah, that's a good point too. Yeah. Didn't think about that. So then the other thing, talking about promoting, yeah, I see that all the time. I can tell which of my guests are promoting because I've got like a base listeners that I have that's pretty consistent. So I can see, okay, if they don't share it, I should expect this many listeners because podcasting's pretty consistent. But you do see that a lot of guests don't promote it, and it's already this well-produced piece of content. And usually the guest has the audience who cares more about them. So, it doesn't make too much sense that they don't share it, but it's very common that they don't. So especially in your early days of being a podcast guest, I think it says a lot about you if you do share that. And that'll, especially if you show that you shared that when you go to your second or third show, I think that adds a lot of value too.
Very much so. And we're all vain, right? We all listen for our own name. So when you share it, tag the podcast host in it so it shows up in their feed for a couple of reasons. One, it keeps you top of mind for them, right? So maybe they'll invite you back on to talk about something else. Maybe they'll mention you to another podcast host. And, just the other thing is the right thing to do, right? If they're promoting you, you should be promoting them. And often, people will say, well, I want the big guest on, right? Well, podcast hosts realize after a while, sometimes those big names really don't help you that much, right? If they stick to their talking points, you know what they're going to say. That's one of 10 podcast interviews they did that day. They're not going to promote them all out. So it's more like they're leveraging your audience more than you are leveraging the guest audience. So sometimes It can be that medium level guest. I can think of a friend of mine had a admiral on in the Navy and was talking about parenting, and 2-star admiral thought it was such a great interview. He went and shared it with the battle group that he was on, which was like this guy's ideal listeners. And then he was sharing it with guys in the Pentagon that he worked with, that he was just on a podcast. And it was one of the first shows that he had done. And all of a sudden, this podcast host started to seeing, thousands of new listeners, and they all looked like they were in the Navy. And he's like, that was better than any big name guest he ever had.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. For me, I can definitely say that's true. I've had several guests with over 1 million subscribers or 1 million followers, some very large influencers, but I haven't really seen any of them share it. But I've had some of the smallest guests that I've had actually do the best performance because they've got that niche, followership. So I've actually seen what you said is true too. It's not necessarily the biggest people. I mean, the biggest people are great because they've been through a lot and they have a lot of value and come with different perspectives. But as far as getting people to share the show, it's more common with people that aren't as large.
Yeah. And, I'm a big fan of Dave Ramsey. Admire what he has done. But if you have him on your podcast, you pretty much know here's his talking points. He's not going to say anything new. He's not going to go off of his script. And, he's not going to promote it to his, 50 million followers afterwards. So from that standpoint, it's a much more interesting interview. Introduce me to somebody that I've never heard of before.
Right. Yeah, that's a good one. And you had mentioned that, by sharing it and tagging people, they're going to get you more top of mind too. So I know that when I talked to Aaron Walker, he had talked about there's many podcasts he's been on as a guest several times. And I know that you said that you've been on 1,200 guest appearances. Out of those, I mean, have you had a good amount that have been repeat appearances on the same podcast, just out of curiosity?
They have. And the other thing too about sending people back to a dedicated welcome page is you can attribute the traffic. So all of a sudden there's a lot of podcasts that I might have been invited back on, but if it didn't do well the first time, as far as, engaging, I may not be as quick to go back on the second time. But if it's one where, it was a home run the first time, heck, I want to build the relationship and see if I can get on there again. Another thing that we've seen with a lot of our clients is if they've got somebody else in the company, they can talk about different things. At one time, HubSpot, when we were working with them, they had 4 different spokespersons for the company. So you can get, we called it multiple bites at the apple, right? So they may not have the same person back, a quarter from now, but you can bring somebody else on to talk about another viewpoint. And so, if you promote, if you do a good job, you'll get invited back. If you wait and reach out to them 18 months later and said, Jeremy, I was so happy to be on your podcast. I'd like to come back because I wrote a book and I want to promote it on your podcast. Most podcast hosts go, no,
Right.
you didn't help me the first time. You looked at it as transaction, not a relationship. Just don't come back now just because you need something.
Yeah, I like that. That's definitely true. I've experienced that personally as well. All right, so we've talked through the whole pretty much life cycle for somebody who's new to being a guest on podcasts. But let's say someone's been a guest on, I don't know, let's say 5-ish podcasts now. They've got some experience. How does the process change for someone who's a little bit more seasoned and experienced in the podcast guesting space?
Well, I would push back on, I don't think you're comfortable after 5. For me, it was probably a couple dozen before I really got comfortable with it. One of the things when you start seeing doing more than say 5 or 10, make sure you're focusing on different things on each podcast. Don't do Groundhog's Day where you talk about the same thing each and every time. Not only will it get boring for you, it'll get boring for the listeners, and it's really hard to repurpose. So, we can take this podcast interview and can repurpose it, and what you should know as a podcast guest just getting started, and maybe just make a blog out of the initial section there, but focus on different areas there. You don't want to keep talking about the same canned message over and over, right? Because after a while, it can almost be, can get to be a joke, right? So if people hear you on 4 podcast interviews and every one is the same, it's like, okay, they're going off. They've got 4 stories and they tell them all the time. Right. Seth Godin is a great one for that. I love listening to Seth Godin because he never goes off of talking points. He's always talking about what's new, what he's learning, what he's feeling. And so I think that's important. So I would say as you get more podcast interviews, make sure you're not just phoning it in, right? Oh, I've done a dozen podcast interviews. I don't need to prepare. You wouldn't walk onto somebody's stage without preparing, right? So if somebody invites you to their podcast, the average podcast right now has 135 listeners. Top 20% get 1,500 listeners. So just imagine somebody invites you, hey, Jeremy, I've got a live event coming. Do you want to speak on the stage? I'll give you the microphone for 45 minutes. You wouldn't walk up there and go, I'll just wing it, right? I have no idea who the audience is, what they're talking about, what they're interested in. I'll just wing it. But yet most people do that on podcast interviews after they've done some and they get comfortable. And it does a disrespect to the podcast host and to the podcast guest, right? And to the audience. So listen to some of the podcasts before. Know who you're talking to. Know what the vibe of it is. I used to just cringe when I'd listen to a podcast and he'd ask the same questions to every person. And it was John Lee Dumas. If you woke up in an alternate universe with $2,000, what would you do? And there'd be people go, I've never thought of that. And I would just cringe. It's like every person in the audience is thinking, oh, this person's a carpetbagger. They've never listened to this podcast. Right. They don't respect us enough to even do that. Now the flip side of that is there's a great podcast called Creative Warriors with Jeffrey Shaw. And the joke on the podcast is when Jeffrey goes off on a tangent, he'll just stop and say squirrel, from the Up movie with Doug the dog that would go off. And so if you know that, I was listening to one guest that must have listened to the podcast and knew it, right? So he goes off on a tangent. He stopped and said, squirrel. With that, it was like, oh man, this person's one of us, right? Nice. So the more you do, just don't get so comfortable on it that you don't prepare. Because if you mess up a speech on a physical stage, The good news is there's only going to be 100 people that see it, right? And they'll probably forget about it. But if you mess up on a podcast interview, it's there forever. If you call the guest or the host by the wrong name, the other day I was on a podcast, and the host name was Nina, Nina. Well, our company, I'm a client of it too. They give us a brief sheet for every podcast, and they had told me this is the podcaster's name and here's the pronunciation. If I would have jumped up on there and said, "Hey, Nina, I am so glad to be here. I love the show." Everybody listening would have gone, "You've never listened to the show because you can't get the host's name right."
Right. And then the whole idea is to leverage that audience, and you're losing the respect when you make those mistakes or you don't know the inside lingo for that specific community.
Yeah, because you figure, you are the celebrity here, Jeremy. I mean, people are coming to listen to you. So if you aren't prepared to respect the person that they respect, you're never going to do well with that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. All right, so I guess what we're talking about here is what we talked about earlier. You should do that in a non-scalable method for the first couple dozen interviews. Get comfortable share all new stuff, and then when you get more comfortable, let's say it's time to start leveraging it and go a little bit bigger with it. So maybe you've been on 20 to 30 podcasts as a guest. What do you see that usually changes for guests for shows, or as in regards to like the process, like their outreach or how they approach it?
Really, you should look back at the information that you've gained off of the first series of shows, right? So like when you send people to that dedicated welcome page, you can attribute the traffic and you'll know which podcasts convert well and which ones don't, right? So part of business success is doubling down on what works and stop doing what doesn't. So early on, for example, we worked with a great coach, Craig Cody. He's a retired New York City detective. He's a CPA, sort of a fractional CFO. And early on, we were able to work with them and say, you do really well with dentists. And he's like, "Oh, I love working with dentists." And he's like, they have, the disposable income. They're educated. They're the decision makers. I love dentists. So with that, for the next probably quarter or two, all we put him on was dental podcasts, right? And from that, it was like fish in a barrel. So instead of trying all these different podcasts, we knew these would work really well. And now he's got his own podcast, like on dental business. And, he's the CPA to all the dentists. And so he knew that from looking at the data of his early podcast interviews to figure out what's working, what's not working. And that's one of the things I see. A lot of people will come and say, "I just want to do more podcast interviews." That would just be like saying, I want to do more advertising. Well, what advertising works for you, right? Are you going to double down on the yellow pages? Are you going to double down on billboards? Are you going to double down on Facebook? Why don't you figure out which one works best for you? Then just double it down, because you can waste a whole lot of time and money just doing random podcasts, and not all of them will move the needle. And at the end of the day, the most limited resource we all have is our time. With those 1,200 podcast interviews, I learned a lot from those, but there was probably over half of those that didn't move the needle. And so from that standpoint, I'd rather see somebody go on, 50 podcasts that move the needle than try to break my record of 1,200.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So you said to learn that works, and so what you're saying in regards to like the first 20 or 30 episodes that you've done, you're suggesting that they have the landing page, and then you're tracking how much traffic's going to that landing page, so you know that what's working. And so for this guest that you just mentioned, who's the CPA, he got the biggest results from dental podcasts. So he did like a wider range in the early days, figured out that the dental podcast was sort of getting him more traffic. So then that's where he decided, okay, let's niche down and let's buckle down on what's working right here.
Right. And you can do that either through dedicated welcome pages. That way you can, quantify the traffic. You could also do it in your funnels, right? If you ask people, where did you find out about us? They may just say podcast and not the specific one. Or if you're having one-on-one conversations with them, right? We always ask it of our clients, hey, where did you find out about us? Because that's a great way to figure out where your actual customers are coming from.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So speaking as far as being a guest in other podcasts as a podcast host, I see that a lot of guests or a lot of other hosts sort of see like if you have some relevancy to them, it's got that pressure that's going to be like let's do a guest for guest, and if your goal is to try to get out there and leverage other audiences, and you have a pretty good solid guest base right currently. How do you see people navigating that space? Because sometimes it can feel like a fine line.
Yeah, I think you've always got to put your audience at the forefront, right? Your allegiance should always be to your audience. And so if it brings value to them, then you say yes. I just see sometimes guest swaps where people just go on Facebook, hey, does anybody want to do a guest swap? Is that bringing the most value? Is that looking out for your audience? So if it makes sense, yeah, do it. And podcast guesting is a great way to build your audience, right? Years ago, Cliff Ravenscraft, who was known as the podcast answer man, said something that was so true and obvious that it was just like, duh. He said, the best place to find podcast listeners is listening to podcasts, right? Even today, only 51% of the US population listens to podcasts. So if you advertise on Facebook, maybe 49% of them don't listen to podcasts. They're not going to start just because of you. So why would you advertise to them? Whereas if you're on a podcast, you know that 100% of the people there listen to podcast interviews. And there's some great examples out there. Jordan Harbinger used to be on a podcast called Art of Charm. And whole backstory to that one, he got fired from that show. He started the Jordan Harbinger show within like 2 weeks, but nobody knew about it. So over the next probably 60 to 90 days, he went on a guest tour, a guest storm to get on as many other podcasts to talk about his new show. Well, it worked so well that within a quarter, the Jordan Harbinger show ranked higher than the Art of Charm ever did. So that's a great way just to get out there and get in front of podcast listeners.
Right. Oh, that's huge. So, it's not, it's a lot of work to go out there and research and find podcasts that you might be a good fit for, especially in the early days. So are there any, tools, websites, or processes that maybe you'd suggest that could help make that easier? I know that you've got one that you've developed yourself, but I'm also curious, maybe more details on that, but also other stuff that's out there.
Yeah, I'll tell you exactly how our algorithm that we use. So finding podcasts today is easier than ever, right? So you can go to iTunes. You can just go to Google and search your keywords and put podcast in there. They'll show up there. You can go to Chartable. You can go to Listen Notes. There's all kinds of different directories out there to find the podcasts. The problem is not finding the podcasts, right? There's a million shows out there. Getting on a podcast is not the tough part. It's getting on one that matters. And a lot of times people say, well, I want to be on the big ones. Well, bigger is not better. Better is better. And especially starting out, if you've got nothing to offer, if you've got no track record, your chances of saying, I want to go on the big shows isn't going to work. So our algorithm always looks at 4 things, and I always encourage people to look at this. The first one's the podcast itself, right? Do they have my ideal audience? Have they been around long enough, right? Most podcasts that die within the first 10 episodes. You don't want to be interview number 5 when they stop paying their hosting bill at number 7. No one will ever find you. Do they have ratings and reviews? Is it a podcast that you would want to be associated with, right? There's some crappy shows out there that you probably just listen to them, right? And it's like, yeah, the host sounds like they're calling in on the phone. Probably not one I want to be associated with long term. So spend some time looking at that from the very beginning. The second thing is podcasts, when you do a guest appearance on it, should always give you a backlink, right? Because you said that earlier. Oh, I'll link to that. Well, thank you, because that's a signal to the search engines that you think our site is valuable. So with that, we've got some clients that do it just for the search engine optimization and those backlinks. So they'll look at, in the industry, it's called the Moz score, which is an authority ranking. Alexa score is like how popular they are. So you can look at that. We've got some.
For me, I always link to the homepage of the guest or all their relevant websites, and then for your example, giving a specific page that will be there in addition to it. So you've got the homepage and that specific page.
And we've got some clients that do it just for the backlinks. You could ask them, hey, do you want to be on Tim Ferriss's podcast? Or we've got a podcast from Harvard University Business School. And it's got 500 listeners. And they'll go, oh, give me the one that ends in harvard.edu every time. Right. So we look at, the podcast, the website. Third thing is, how much are they promoting it on social media or to their email list? There's some platforms out there. Blog Talk Radio's one. It's really easy to record it. They record it, but some hosts will never promote it on their social media. So is it going to get really seen? And then finally, we look at experience with previous clients, right? Some podcasts have always converted well. Other ones haven't. One of the things to look at on there is like, we've got that data, but an overarching thing is that if it's a real conversation, they always convert better. If the questions are all scripted and there's 5 questions and no matter what you answer, the next question is, so what book is on your nightstand? It's really hard to tell your story or connect with an audience that way. So there's the thing to look at, the podcast, the website, the reach, and then is it an interesting interview?
Okay. And you were saying to look at 4 things, and the first thing was the podcast itself. Were the other things underlying pieces to that, or are there 3 other things?
No. So the podcast is the number one thing there. Underlying things there is number of episodes, ratings and reviews. Do they have your target audience?
Okay. Awesome. And so for you've built a database, and you've got the research of all these other podcasts. You've seen the kind of results that come from different podcasts. So you know which ones are working or not working. And then you help other people that are in your community to sort of navigate that space. That's sort of a quick summary of your tool.
So with that, some of it's art, some of it's science, some of it's experience, but it all goes together to find out the best podcast. And that's what we help our clients with.
Awesome. So, are there any other websites or tools or processes that come up for you that you've seen that people are doing that is working well for them, as far as maybe finding the podcast itself, and then maybe like how to approach reaching out at scale if you had already done 20 or 30 interviews, like the person you mentioned with the dental podcast space?
I think the reaching out at scale can be very, very tough, right? Okay. Because think about the 3 types of people that any podcast host want to have on their show. It's friends, friends of friends, and people they want to be on their friends. Nowhere in there is it a cold pitch. I'm amazed at the number of courses out there right now that'll teach you how to write the one pitch that will get everybody to say yes. It doesn't exist, right? It might have worked for them, but it won't work for you. I was joking. I thought I could do a course of like the 5 or 6 words that you can tweet to get on any podcast. I want to be on your show. If you're Oprah or, one of the presidents of the United States, depending what show you're going after, Oprah could probably tweet any podcast host and say, I want to be on your show. And that pitch would work. But for mere mortals, it wouldn't. I think one of the most powerful ways once you get up and going is asking podcast hosts, are there any other podcasters that you can think of that I could add value to? Right? Because think about it. If you're doing, start out doing a podcast a week and they keep giving you two recommendations, it keeps doubling every life cycle there. Soon you'll get, oh, I've already been on that show, or I don't want to be on that show. But that's one of the most powerful ways to do it. If you want to talk at scale there, that really works. What I think is actually going and hurting people is these robo pitches. You can buy lists right now. They're hurting people. There was just a comment or a thing in Pod News today with a keynote on it was, is spam a big problem in our industry? And more podcasters are putting that out there, right? So people are scraping RSS feeds to find the podcaster's email, and they're selling that or putting it out there. And more, people aren't seeing the pitch, so there's no magic to it because it's just getting filtered out.
Right. Makes a lot of sense. Awesome. Well, I mean, I think we've covered a lot here. We've talked about the whole journey for a new person getting to podcast guesting, and then how to leverage the other podcast audiences. Talked about sort of how many it takes to get to a more established state to be able to find where you want to niche down. So 20 or 30 episodes, and it's never really a scalable process. It's always going to be referrals or doing the actual legwork to see if you're a fit, and then reaching out by sharing what kind of value you can add to the audience. So I think that we've got a ton of value here today. So I appreciate you sharing all that.
Well, thank you, Jeremy. And one of my favorite phrases is, "What's ordinary to you is amazing to others." So all of us have something that we know. We've got expertise in it, and it's never been easier to share that. If you're a writer, use blogs. If you love being on video, do video interviews. But to me, podcasting is easy. Everybody can talk about their experience, and even introverts can have that one-on-one conversation and still reach the masses. So what's ordinary to you is amazing to other people, and definitely share that and make the world a better place.
Awesome. Yeah, I was going to ask you for some last words, and I think that covers it. So what's the best way for someone to reach out to you? I know we talked about going to your website, and then you'll have something there. So do you want to talk about that real quick?
Yeah, I'll put everything on interviewvalet.com/WhyInfluence. And we have found that is the best practice, right? So as you're listening to this, you're working out, you're mowing the lawn, you're making dinner, you're driving somewhere. You don't want to have the guest say, well, you can find me on Twitter here and Instagram here, and here's my phone number. All of that just confuses people. Give them one easy place to go to, and give them things there that are value. So, if you want my social media or my email, just go to that page. There's the small yes of the checklist, how to prepare for your first podcast interview. Checklists are written in blood. Make sure it's somebody else's. So I'll put that there at interviewvalet.com/WhyInfluence. The copy of the book, if you're in the United States, I'll send you a free digital copy or physical copy if you want. If you're outside, this is a digital copy. Or if you just want to, jump on a discovery call and see if podcast interview marketing might work to build your brand and your business, just all of that will be back there at interviewvalet.com/WhyInfluence.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Tom, for coming on today. You shared a ton of value. If you're listening, make sure you go to Tom's website. I also have links to that in the show notes of my website. But if you are on your internet browser, just go ahead and navigate straight to his. Otherwise, if you can't remember it, you can always drop back to mine and navigate to it. But yeah, thanks so much. I mean, that was a ton of value, and I'm sure it was helpful for me, and I'm sure it's helpful for a lot of for listeners here today.
Well, thank you, Jeremy.
And real quick before I let you go, I like to ask the guests for some feedback, because I'm on my journey of sharing and becoming like a better podcast host. And you've been on a lot of shows yourself, so I'm curious Do you have any feedback or thoughts on how the show went or the whole flow of everything?
The flow was great. And I love this platform of StreamYard, that live streaming. It's like, why wouldn't you take the interview and do it that way? One of the things I have learned over video is to put that branding in wherever you can, right? So if anybody's watching this, there's a reason there's a mic flag with Interview Valet on it, right? So I don't have to keep saying it. You see it there. I love how you've got the screen behind you that shows WhyInfluence. I would probably move over a little bit. Then move that over so you could see it, right? It's that subtle branding in the backdrop, but your questions are well thought out, well reasoned, and it's a nice conversation. You've got a very, I think I mentioned it earlier, thoughtful and deliberate pace where I can actually tell you're listening to questions and you're asking the questions that your audience has. I think that's what we're seeing the best podcasts do. Right. It's a conversation, just like if we were sitting down at, having breakfast at IHOP. Right. And we were talking about these things, and somebody that's a podcast listener, it's like they're sitting in the next booth, and it'd be rude for them just to turn around and stare at us. It'd be rude for them to get in on the conversation, but they're just sitting there thinking about it. And I think the best podcasts interviews is when there's so much more dialogue going on, right? It's not just between the host and the guest, but the person listening, that they start thinking about it. They start having conversations with themselves about it. Or you can always figure out somebody that listens to podcasts. They usually start with, I was listening to this podcast the other day, and then they'll start sharing it there. So it's like that dialogue keeps going on and on there. And Seth Godin talks about that's the definition of remarkable. It's a remarkable podcast if afterwards I make a remark about it. So I think what you're doing here is awesome.
Oh, thanks so much. I appreciate it, Tom. Thanks again for coming on today, and thanks for the feedback. That was awesome.
All the best.